On the evening of September 18th, 2017, I found myself standing on the edge of a trailhead outside Elkins, West Virginia, staring into the endless folds of the Appalachian Mountains and wondering why the air here seemed heavier than anywhere else I had ever been, as if the weight of centuries of untold stories pressed down on every ridge and hollow. And though I had hiked dozens of places across the United States, nothing unsettled me the way the Appalachians did, because these mountains felt alive in a way that went beyond wildlife or wind. They carried a silence that seemed intentional, like the woods were holding their breath whenever someone trespassed too deep. My grandmother, Margaret Lewis, grew up in Randolph County in the 1940s and used to warn me about a stretch of forest locals called Deadman's Hollow, a steep ravine where, according to her, 3 children went missing in the summer of 1953 and were never found, though hunters swore they had heard the sound of children laughing echoing through the gorge years afterward. She told me those stories not as ghost tales, but as facts, and she claimed her own brother, my great-uncle Thomas, refused to step foot near that ravine after spending one night lost there during a storm, later saying he heard voices calling his name in the dark, though no search party had reached him yet. I always dismissed those tales as folklore meant to keep kids from wandering too far, but after my grandmother passed away in May 2017, I discovered in an old cedar chest a bundle of her handwritten notes, describing in unnerving detail not just Deadman's Hollow, but other strange occurrences tied to those ridges. Whispers about lights that moved without source, travelers losing entire hours on the trail, and an entry from August 1959 where she wrote simply, "The mountain takes what it wants, and it always gives something back, but never what was lost." That line haunted me all summer until I finally gave in to the pull, convincing myself I would honor her memory by walking the same ground she feared, by seeing with my own eyes whether the mountains she described truly carried something beyond reason. The date September 18th was not chosen at random. It was the anniversary of the last documented disappearance in Deadman's Hollow, a hiker named Daniel Whitaker in 1998, whose body was never recovered despite weeks of organized search. And the thought of stepping into that ravine on that date gave me the kind of nervous energy that is half dread and half compulsion. A sense that whatever truth lay hidden there would only reveal itself if I showed up at the right moment. So with a small pack, a flashlight, a canteen, and my grandmother's notes folded in my pocket, I left the faint sound of highway behind and stepped onto the trail as twilight spread across the ridges, certain that I was walking towards something I could never fully prepare for, yet unable to turn back. As soon as I crossed into the shadow of Deadman's Hollow that evening, the air seemed to change. The cicadas that had been screaming all along the ridges fell into sudden silence, as though someone had muted the entire forest, and I remember stopping in my tracks thinking it was only my imagination. But when I held my breath, I realized the woods were holding theirs too. A pause so unnatural it made the sound of my own boots crunching the damp soil seem like an intrusion. And I told myself it was just the hour, just the transition from dusk into night when the rhythms of the forest shift. Yet a part of me already felt watched, not by a person, but by the place itself. I carried my grandmother's notes folded in my pocket and pulled them out under the fading light, scanning the shaky handwriting where she had drawn a crude map of the hollow with a circle marked at the base of the ravine, labeled only with the words, "The Still Place." And though the map looked more like memory than cartography, I followed her arrows downward, each step taking me deeper into the kind of silence that presses into your ears until you almost hear ringing. I passed an old oak with a scar down its trunk like it had been struck by lightning decades ago, and beside it the faint outline of stone steps nearly devoured by moss. Steps that did not appear on any official trail, and the sight of them unnerved me because they confirmed what my grandmother had hinted at in her notes, that long before hikers ever came here, people had carved paths into this gorge for reasons now forgotten. I descended those steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature, my breath fogging even though September air in West Virginia should have been warm and heavy. And when I looked back, the last sliver of twilight had vanished, The forest behind me swallowed in gray so quickly I wondered if I had lost time. I checked my watch, 7:43 p.m. The same minute seemed to hold too long. The second hand ticking forward, yet the woods unmoving as if caught between moments. As I pushed deeper, the ground grew softer, spongy with layers of rotting leaves, and the trees leaned at strange angles that made the ravine appear narrower than it was, funneling me toward the heart of something. Somewhere to my left, I thought I heard water, a faint trickling stream, but when I turned that direction, it stopped, replaced by what I can only describe as the faint echo of a child's laugh, high and fleeting, and I froze with the blood pounding in my ears because it sounded close, yet carried no direction, as if the hollow itself had exhaled the sound into me. I whispered Daniel Whitaker's name without meaning to, the hiker who vanished here in 1998, and the name seemed to vanish into the trees like smoke. My flashlight beam swept over a cluster of stones that looked arranged rather than fallen, forming a crude circle on the ground, and I felt compelled to step inside, though every instinct screamed against it. As soon as I did, the air thickened, like walking underwater, and the forest noise did not return, but was replaced by a low hum that was not quite sound, more like pressure against the bones of my skull. I tried to breathe steady and keep moving, telling myself there had to be some natural explanation, but the notes in my pocket grew heavier, almost as if they were pulling me downward toward that marked circle, the still place. And with each step, I felt the growing certainty that I was not retracing my grandmother's fears but stepping into them, making them flesh again on a night chosen by something far older than me. The moment I reached the circle of stones, I felt something shift beneath my feet as though the ground itself inhaled, and for a terrifying instant I swore I was no longer standing on soil, but on something hollow that reverberated faintly with the rhythm of my own pulse. And when I crouched to touch the earth, it felt unnaturally smooth, like worked stone buried just beneath the leaves, too even to be a natural formation. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief strobe of light, the trees around the ravine seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches resembling figures bending to listen, and I felt so certain of their intent that I stumbled back, but the circle of stones held me fast, my legs heavy as if the air itself had congealed around them. The hum that had pressed against my skull grew sharper, rising in pitch until it became indistinguishable from silence. And then I realized the silence had form. It was not absence, but presence, something vast and waiting, and the longer I stood there, the more it seemed to seep into me like water soaking through cloth. I pulled out my grandmother's notes, desperate for explanation, and noticed something I had not before. Faint smudges of pencil lines in the margins, almost erased, words scrawled in shaky hand. Do not answer if they call your name. My heart hammered as those words seared into my brain, because almost instantly I heard it, faint at first but unmistakable, my own name whispered from the darkness beyond the trees, spoken in a tone that mimicked my grandmother's voice exactly, the same gentle lilt she used when waking me as a child, and every fiber of my being strained to respond, to turn, to run toward it. Yet those words on the page burned hotter than instinct and held me still. I clenched my teeth, shaking, whispering no under my breath, and the voice grew sharper, angrier, splintering into something guttural that no longer resembled her, until it snapped off mid-syllable as if cut away by an unseen hand. The flashlight went dark. I stood in pitch black, the kind that eats all depth, and felt the circle of stones grow warm under my boots, a vibration pulsing upward until I swore it matched my heartbeat. And I realized with sudden horror that my pulse had slowed to match it, no longer my own rhythm, but the rhythm of the ground itself, as if the hollow had reached inside me and tuned me to its frequency. I staggered forward, tripping over the stones, and the instant I fell outside the circle, the pressure released like a snapped rope, the air rushing back into my lungs so violently I gasped. When I scrambled to my feet, the forest had changed. The ravine was deeper, the trees taller, their trunks gnarled in patterns that resembled faces twisting in silent screams, and the moon overhead hung impossibly large, casting a pale greenish light that turned the ground silver. I checked my watch again, 1:17 a.m. Somehow hours had vanished in what I thought were only minutes. My body ached as though I had been walking endlessly, yet I had barely moved. Then, from the opposite slope, a flicker of light appeared, faint and golden like a lantern swaying in the distance. And my heart lurched because I remembered my grandmother's note about this still place, where lights would sometimes appear without flame or source, leading travelers deeper until they lost their way forever. Against every rational thought, I felt drawn toward it, my legs moving before I decided. And with each step the light retreated, pulling me along the ravine floor until the path narrowed into a throat of stone walls on either side. The hum returned, louder now, resonating through the rock, and in its vibration I heard fragments of words, not in English, but in some older cadence, a chant that seemed to echo both behind and ahead of me, as though the hollow had no beginning and no end. I should have turned back, but I could not. Something older than fear was pulling me, the same force that had pulled my grandmother's brother in 1953, that had taken Daniel Whitaker in 1998, and I knew with a clarity that chilled my soul that I was walking the exact same path they had, toward the place where the mountain decided who stayed and who returned. I don't know how long I followed that lantern glow, but at some point I realized it no longer moved ahead of me. It hovered still just beyond the reach of my hand as though waiting, suspended in the air without a source. And in its dim golden halo, I saw what looked like a clearing carved into the very center of the ravine, a hollow inside the hollow, perfectly round. The ground paved with slabs of stone that bore faint markings like weathered carvings or letters half swallowed by moss. And at the center of those stones stood nothing except the light itself, burning without wick or fire, a sphere that pulsed in rhythm with the hum that shook the earth beneath me. I wanted to flee, to collapse, to shut my eyes and will myself out of that place. But something in me knew that this was the point my grandmother had written of, the place where the mountain took what it wanted and returned what it chose. And for the first time I understood she had not been speaking in riddles, but in warning. The hum rose until I could no longer hear my own heartbeat. And then in a rush of cold air the silence cracked open and I saw them. Shapes forming around the circle of stone, tall and thin, not bodies but impressions of bodies pressed into the air, shadows that belonged to no light. And though their faces were indistinct, I recognized something in their movements, the way they leaned, the way they seemed to tremble with an urgency that was not entirely hostile but not welcoming either. And when they began to sway as one, the air thickened and I heard once again the sound of children laughing, then men calling, then women weeping, all layered into a single dissonant chord that froze me in place. My own name rose above the others, shouted in a dozen different voices, some I thought I recognized, my grandmother's, my great-uncle's, even a voice that might have been Daniel Whitaker's, but I remembered the warning scrawled in her notes, and I pressed my lips shut so tightly they bled. The shadows quivered as though straining against some boundary, and then, as if disappointed, they withdrew all at once, sinking back into the edges of the hollow, and the light flickered violently before imploding inward until only darkness remained. I fell to my knees on the cold stone, shaking, and when I looked again the clearing was gone, the stone pavement gone, the lantern gone. I was lying on damp earth in the same ravine where I had first stepped into the circle of stones, but dawn light was spilling across the trees. My watch read 6:02 a.m. I had no memory of the hours between. I staggered back to the trailhead with legs that felt like they no longer belonged to me. And when I reached my car, I found my grandmother's notes crumpled and damp in my pocket, as though they had been submerged in water, the ink smeared until only one sentence was legible. It never forgets. I drove away from Elkins that morning with the hollow still ringing in my ears. And though I told myself I would never speak of what I saw, I find that silence is impossible, because the longer I keep it inside, the louder the mountain's hum grows, as if reminding me that what entered me that night cannot be erased. Weeks later, I searched news archives again for Daniel Whitaker and discovered something I had missed. An account from one of the search party members in 1998 claiming he heard Daniel's voice calling out from the ravine, though the others heard nothing. And reading that, I felt my skin crawl because now I understood what had happened, how the mountain doesn't simply take. It echoes, it bends voices into lures. It reshapes memory itself to feed whatever presence stirs beneath its soil. Even now, years later, when I walk through quiet woods or find myself alone at night, I sometimes hear my name whispered low and patient, the exact cadence of my grandmother's voice, and I know without doubt that Deadman's Hollow has not finished with me, that it marked me as it marked her, as it marked every soul who entered its still place, and that one day, whether I resist or not, the mountain will call me back to balance what it gave and what it took.